I'm not going to sugarcoat issues in this documentary. It's about doomsday cults, ghosts, people on death row and executions, but the main issue is Christian explanations for the delay of the space-alien Jesus Josephson. Many groups have claimed that something cataclysmic was imminent, something that I think has scared many people over the ages. This spiritual paranoia often worries me because many people actually believe in all this. Will Jesus return today? Where would I go afterwards? So, in a sense, I'm trying to comfort people because these ideas seem very uncertain indeed. For example, the Seekers, a UFO cult, expected a cataclysmic event in the 1950s, but no doomsday appeared. Well, a new message was revealed to their leader by a space alien named Sananda from a mysterious planet called Clarion. The doomsday event has just been postponed. In a similar way, Christians have said that the return of Jesus was postponed, but how reasonable were their explanations for the delay? Before we begin, there are other issues, because where are such entities? Is it possible to test Sananda or Jesus scientifically in a lab? As it turns out, this is not possible, so we are just supposed to believe in anecdotal evidence instead, like the New Testament and personal experiences that prove his existence. Well, Jesus has supposedly been in outer space for approximately 2,000 years. I think that this claim seems crazy, but let me explain. I read about this story from 1971. This was back in the days of the Soviet Union. A spacecraft named Soyuz 11 went to the Salyut 1 space station. It contained 3 astronauts. They docked and went into the space station and were there for more than 20 days, approximately 200 kilometers above. They were to return on June 29th. They undocked and re-entered Earth's atmosphere. Their capsule landed somewhere in Kazakhstan. Many were excited, for example, their families and friends, but nobody came out of the capsule. Waiting and waiting, but no activity. When they opened the hatch, they saw that all 3 crew members were dead. Why did they die? The fault was traced to a breathing ventilation valve that had opened at an altitude of 168 kilometers, and the resultant loss of pressure was fatal in less than a minute. So if this happens to human beings in outer space, they would die more or less instantly. Well, Jesus has supposedly been in outer space for 2,000 years. By now you ought to see how ridiculous these claims are, but I'm only getting started. There are approximately 40 million kilometers from Earth to our neighbor Venus, and a bit longer to Mars. If you travel towards the Sun, it becomes hotter, and if you travel outwards, it becomes colder. There is approximately 400 degrees Celsius on the planet Venus and minus 200 degrees in the outer solar system. The Sun's radiation is also cancerous, but we have an atmosphere that shields us from most of it. But Jesus has lived under these conditions in the vacuum of space for 2,000 years. You might have seen the movie Man of Steel about Superman, which is a good movie. He can travel in outer space, but no such thing is possible in reality. So these claims seem ridiculous, but what about the Christian explanations for the delay of the coming of this space alien called Jesus? Why didn't it return? Well, some people actually believe that he regularly returns like a ghost on Earth, because he, for some weird reason, makes himself invisible down here. But the problem for reasonable people is that it's not reasonable to believe in ghosts, because such entities can't be tested scientifically, but this doesn't mean that horror or ghost hunting movies aren't entertaining. However, it is possible to examine their biblical explanations for this delay. So how did they explain this problem? It was supposedly delayed because only God knows the day and hour. This explanation seems similar to the Seekers, because only the space alien Sananda controlled the timing. One historical background for this idea of waiting for God seems to be the prophetic tradition. For example, the prophet Habakkuk, who was active in approx 612 BCE, wrote this: "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." People believed that such prophetic messages were divine, so you just had to wait until something happened. So people just kept on waiting, even though it perhaps seemed more likely that the soothsayer was wrong. Delayed because of the abomination of desolation. The doomsday prophet Daniel wrote about this. In the New Testament it says that after this supposed event in the temple, One named the Son of Man, Jesus, was soon to arrive. Paul also mentioned this in 2 Thessalonians. What did they have in mind? For example, the book of Daniel, chapter 9. Critical scholars believe that the historical context in Daniel was the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE. Antiochus IV Epiphanes forced another religion on the Jews. When Daniel mentioned the abomination of desolation, he was referring to pagan altars that Antiochus placed in their temple. We don't see this explanation in the New Testament because there we learn that the abomination of desolation in Daniel was happening in the 1st century CE. So Jesus and Paul didn't know about the historical context in Daniel. This is another example of dubious explanations. Jesus didn't return because something had to happen in the temple in the 1st century that actually had happened in the 2nd century BCE. Delayed because God has a different almanac. Because according to God, one day could mean 1,000 years and 1,000 years one day. The background for such ideas seems, as mentioned, to be prophets like Habakkuk. Many believed that you had to wait for prophecies to happen because they believed that messages of soothsayers had a divine origin. Today, many would undoubtedly say that this kind of knowing seems very doubtful when we compare it to the scientific methods. But the early Christians probably explained the delay by such prophetic ideas, and now Christians have waited for 2,000 years. Delayed because of salvation. Peter mentioned that the space alien delays its coming because it wants to save as many as possible. Let's think about salvation for a moment. What does this mean in the New Testament? And were their explanations reasonable? But first I will mention two analogies to the crucifixion. Maybe you've seen the movie The Green Mile. In this movie, some men are in prison waiting for the electric chair. One scene in the movie shows how horrible this was. The prisoners were not in control of the situation because they were controlled by prison officers until their execution. Another example is the movie A Royal Affair with Mads Mikkelsen, who played the role of Johann Friedrich Struensee. In one scene, he is in a carriage. He was told in prison by a priest that the king would pardon him, but when the carriage stopped, guards threw him in front of the executioner. Well, he then chopped his head off with an axe. Something like this happened in the New Testament. A person was sentenced to death by crucifixion and was executed. Usually, prisoners are not in control of such situations, but Christians most probably tried to whitewash or rationalize away this reality. Let me explain. For example, it's claimed that Jesus had planned the crucifixion long before his birth, as mentioned in John 1, so he was supposedly in control of this situation. Or, for example, the prayer in Gethsemane about the cup, meaning that the execution was God's will and hence predestined, or his foreknowledge of the betrayal of Judas, Peter and others, or that Jesus finally kind of like sprinted on his way to the executioners to be executed. But does this scenario seem ordinary? Does it seem similar to criminals who end up on death row? Is it usually something that criminals plan to do before their birth? Most people would undoubtedly say no, because this is not how such events happen in reality, so perhaps it's not that unreasonable to conclude that such passages are examples of Christian propaganda done Vaticinium ex eventu, that means long after the event. Hence, everything was most probably more chaotic and random originally, like in reality Jesus, a criminal, probably was forced to be crucified against his will for some criminal offences. Such logical observations question the supposed predestined death sentence in the New Testament. But then, we also see that Jesus in Matthew 19:4 and Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 believed in Adam and Eve. This couple and their descendants were condemned to the eternal flames of hell for their heinous crime. Against the will of God, they had eaten a fruit salad. So, at the crucifixion, Jesus had to save all people from these vegetarian psychopaths. You're right, none of this is logical, and no serious person believes in Adam and Eve today. We tend to call this story a myth, so they explained the crucifixion with fake news. Why fake news? Well, when was Adam created? If we look at the biblical chronology, about 4000 BCE, if you don't know this, science says that bipedalism started about 6 million years ago, Homo sapiens perhaps about 300,000 years ago, but life started as such about 4 billion years ago on planet Earth. The Bible also says that everything was created in 6 days, but science says that it has taken about 14 billion years to create the universe. Can people be over 900 years old like Adam? There are other such issues, but the main problem is that Adam and Eve never existed, because the first human beings weren't created 4,000 years ago, or the first patriarch. Well, this does not seem like a good explanation for the delay of the coming of Jesus. I've already mentioned the prophetic tradition, and supposedly all that happened at the crucifixion also had a supernatural plan, because soothsayers had prophesied about everything. So, for example, the soothsayer Isaiah had predicted the crucifixion in chapter 53. I will only mention this example, but the same problem is with their interpretations of other so-called prophecies. The main problem is that they interpreted them ahistorically or futuristically, and did not take the historical context of this and that passage into account. So we see that the prophet Isaiah supposedly lived in the 8th century BCE, 700 to 800 years before the birth of Jesus, but somehow he was prophesying about Jesus. No, it's more probable that he prophesied to his own people in the 8th century BCE. Ordinary history books say that Isaiah chapter 53 was written approximately during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE by another person than Isaiah, and that the suffering servant is about the Jewish people and not Jesus. But early Christians believed that it was a prophecy about Jesus. In such passages, the early Christians saw that the crucifixion had a supernatural plan, but the problem is that their interpretations were wrong. So far, their explanations for the so-called salvation seem a bit unreasonable. They also describe Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. But the historical context for the crucifixion of Jesus was the Roman and Jewish judicial systems, and not the sacrificial cult. Depictions of human sacrifices in the Aztec culture exist. A human being went up the stairs to a temple to be sacrificed to some god, for example, to Tlaloc. But this didn't happen to Jesus because this had nothing to do with the sacrificial cult where people sacrificed different animals in Jesus' day. No, this was about a so-called criminal who was sentenced to death by the judicial systems. Once again, early Christians explained the crucifixion in a wrong way. Perhaps they really believed in all this and that the space alien had patience because of this gospel. But such explanations for the delay seem very doubtful. They also said that the gospel ought to be preached to the whole world before the coming of Jesus. But as already shown, the so-called gospel is very uncertain. For decades, people were indoctrinated. Brainwashed into a spiritual paranoia. A world full of demons, ghosts, punishing gods and burning flames in the afterlife. But don't be afraid any longer. All this is fake news.